We were all prepared to go and land. Basically in a German ship, still in German territory. All they could really do, unless some country would allow us in, would be turn back. All efforts to get in some place, the United States or others, turned out to be unsuccessful. So the level of despair among passengers was visibly and tangibly worse and worse.
Dr. Frederick Reif is remembering an ocean voyage in 1939 that became popularly known as the Voyage of the Damned. 11 years old at the time, Dr. Reif was one of more than 900 Jews on board the German ship, the SS St. Louis, fleeing the Nazis. They had received entry visas to travel to Cuba, and from there would await their quota number to be able to enter the United States.
It left, I think, May 13th, if I remember correctly. And it took about a couple of weeks to the crossing.
The ship sailed into Cuba's Havana harbor on May 27, 1939.
We were asked to disembark early in the morning, and so we got up around 4 or 5 in the morning, and we just sat around and nothing happened. Finally, we were told that there were some difficulties. And the glitch was that the Cuban government, who had in fact issued these permits, entry permits, had decided that they did not want to honor these permits.
The story of the SS St. Louis's ill-fated journey from Hamburg to Havana is one of the saddest in Holocaust history. Over 900 Jews from all over Europe had purchased fares on the German luxury liner with their Cuban entry permits in hand. The permits allowed them to escape from countries that were persecuting Jews and start a new life. As the Nazis enacted laws that were more and more restrictive and punitive, it became clear that there was no future for the Jews of Europe. Frederick Reif and his Austrian Jewish family knew they had to flee.
In 1938, when I was 11 years old, Austria was occupied by the Germans, overrun by the Germans. That particular event really changed my life completely. There's brown shirt troops would essentially plunder Jewish stores and capture Jews on the street and force them on the hands and knees to clean the sidewalk. It became an impossible situation. My father was a dentist and he was not allowed to practice anymore, and he got very depressed, and so 6 months later he committed suicide.
Frederick was left with his mother and younger sister. The family was suffering financially, socially, and even academically. Like all Jews, Frederick was pulled from his school and sent to a special Jewish institution following the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany in March 1938. Then, on November 10th, came Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass. The first organized violence by the Nazis against Jewish individuals and businesses.
A teacher came in the school and said, "You better go home, all of you, as fast as possible." And so we all departed, and there were people running across the street, dragging tourists behind them and stuff like that. And so I finally made it home, and things were fairly quiet. And then in the evening, there were about 4 or 5 people who came and rang the doorbell. One of them was a super of our apartment, and they came with a pistol, and they went through all our belongings and took whatever they could and insulted my mother and so on and so forth. That was Kristallnacht for me.
The Jews of Austria, in fact, were shocked by how quickly the Austrians adopted anti-Semitic laws.
The various edicts and other legislation which had essentially been passed for Jews since 1933 in Germany were all of a sudden imposed in Austria in a much shorter period. And so you found a much quicker transition to that. The moment we got overrun, it was very clear that it was an untenable situation, but there was no way of getting out. So there's a question, who will let you in? So basically we felt, and certainly my father felt, we were trapped animals.
After his father's death, Frederick's mother continued to look for a way out. She finally bought an entrance visa to Cuba, and from there, the family hoped to make its way to the United States. But why Cuba?
The reason we couldn't go to the States was because there was a quota in the United States, a quota restriction, which only allowed a certain limited number of people to enter. And so this was a possibility to go to Cuba, to spend a bit of time there, and then afterwards go to the States. So that was the plan. Now, the plan didn't work out, but that was the plan.
The Reifs booked first-class passage on the SS St. Louis, a luxury liner bound from Hamburg to Havana. But why would refugees fleeing book first-class passage?
None of us as Jews were allowed to take any money out. So all the money we had to be left behind. So we might as well buy a first-class ticket instead of leaving it behind. And so the trip was like a luxury cruise.
The passengers had fancy dinners and dances.
It struck me as a kid as bizarre, because here the people who just escaped from death concentration camp, and they're acting like people on a first-class voyage. It seemed unnatural to me.
The voyage across the Atlantic was uneventful. Then the boat pulled into the Havana harbor. Political infighting, as well as growing anti-refugee sentiment, led the Cuban government to not honor the entry visas. Then began frantic negotiations to try to find a haven for the 900 Jews.
So finally it became clear after about a week that basically the ship could not stay, and therefore it had to turn back and go back to Germany. This changed the mood completely. There were suicide attempts among passengers. The atmosphere on the ship on the way back was just terrible, because everybody said, what that means going back to Germany, and the conditions worse than the ones from which they departed.
The Jewish Joint Distribution Committee worked feverishly to convince Cuban President Federico Buhl to allow the refugees in, and though the world press covered the story and described the plight of the Jews on board, no country, including the United States, was moved to accept them. Captain Schroeder sailed within miles of Miami in hopes that it would pressure the U.S. to give safe haven to the refugees.
And so we came within sight of Miami. In fact, there were Coast Guard ships which seemed to follow the ship, probably to make sure nobody would jump ship. So we were very close, but since nothing happened, the ship had just to turn back and turn east and go.
With no one willing to take in the 900 Jews, Captain Schroeder had no choice but to return to Germany.
And then it was only in the last moment, about a couple of days before due to arrive in Germany, the telegram arrived that because of negotiations, 4 countries in Europe, namely France, England, Belgium, and Holland, had decided to divide the refugees among them. And so instead of turning back to Germany, the ship went on to Antwerp in Belgium, where it landed, and then it could disembark the various passengers and send them to these various countries.
The ship sailed into Antwerp on June 17, 1939, a little more than a month after leaving Germany. The passengers were divided up as follows. 214 remained in Belgium, 288 went to Great Britain, 181 to the Netherlands, and 224 went to France. The Reifs were sent to live in the small French town of Oudan. The family had no money, no resources, and didn't know the language, but Frederick was smart and soon adapted.
Oudan was a town of about 5,000 inhabitants, and there was one public school, and there was one head teacher who essentially paid special attention to me so I'd learn language and stuff like this. End of academic year, I was pretty much perfectly fine. I was okay. I could compete with the best of them. But this was also the time when Germany invaded France.
That was in May 1940. Once again, the Reifs faced danger. They fled to southern France, which was not yet under German control. The family ended up in Limoges, with hundreds of thousands of other refugees escaping German troops.
To tell you the truth, all the living conditions were very primitive. This was the happiest years of my childhood. Why? Because I was now in a large city. I could go to school, could compete properly with the French boys. I could go to conservatory and for nothing get well-done lessons. I could do more than I could do before.
In the fall of 1941, the Reif family's application for a visa to the United States finally came up. After several weeks of anxious waiting, the family boarded a boat to the United States out of Lisbon, Portugal. But life in the U.S. provided its own challenges. Robbed of his childhood, Frederick never truly adjusted to life here.
I felt very separated from my contemporaries because I had much more experience with life than they had, and was therefore much more mature. On the other hand, socially, they were much more mature than I was. They had had a life, they were dating and stuff like this. I was a young kid, no experience. So I felt a great gap. And that gap between me and the rest has persisted throughout life. I'm not like other people, okay?
Frederick Reif, his sister, and mother survived what became known as the Voyage of the Damned. Of the 288 passengers admitted to England, all survived, except one person killed during an air raid in 1940. 87 Jews emigrated before the Germans invaded Western Europe in May 1940. 532 persons, including the Reifs, were trapped in Western Europe. By the end of the war, 278 remained alive, and 254 had died. The 84 who had been admitted to Belgium, 84 to Holland, and 86 who had resettled in France.
In fact, one thing which struck me throughout all the journeys, there were several occasions where I could easily have died. There's absolutely no doubt. But, for some odd reason, the toss of the dice, whether this goes on. So the answer is, it so happened we were sent to France. If we had been sent to England, it probably would have been easier. Sent to Holland would have been more catastrophic. All life is, to a large extent, luck.
There is no such a thing, everybody is evil, because evil destroys you. You have to make peace with yourself.
Ernie Light has more reasons than most to feel the world is evil. He survived Hungarian labor camps, a Nazi death march, the infamous killing center Auschwitz, and the Dachau concentration camp. He saw most of his family killed by the Nazis. But Ernie values life. He was born on July 9th, 1920, in eastern Czechoslovakia.
I came from a large family, a family of 10 children. I was the youngest in the family. My father was 50 when I was born, and my oldest brother was 25. Somehow we managed. We were not rich, but we were not poor either. We had a lot of land, but no cash.
That was the fate of most of Czechoslovakia's Jews. They were among the poorest Jews in all of Europe, and were coping with the effects of a worldwide depression in the 1930s. Czechoslovakia was cobbled together at the end of World War I from territories of several adjacent countries. When Hitler came to power, he demanded that the part of Czechoslovakia that was home to a large population of ethnic Germans be annexed back to Germany. In 1938, under the Munich Pact, the area known as the Sudetenland was given back to Germany to appease Hitler and stop a possible European war. Ernie's part of Czechoslovakia, Subcarpathia Rus, was taken by Hungary, which was then allied with Germany in March 1939.
In 1941, Irish military age, I was supposed to go into the Hungarian army. I went for my physical, I passed it, and in October, I was supposed to go into the army.
Hungary inducted Jews into their army, but they were kept apart from the Christian units.
We became so-called labor units. We didn't have any kind of military equipment, but they wanted us to experience some of the basic training feelings.
For the next 2 years, Ernie and his labor unit were sent all over Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. They repaired barracks in the Hungarian mountains and built roads outside Transylvania. Eventually, Ernie ended up in Yugoslavia at one of the largest copper mines in Europe. There, he encountered Germans who were not hostile to Jewish laborers.
We had one of them who was exceptional, even remember his name. His name was Saunders. When we worked night shifts, he used to take and build a fire, and at lunchtime he went back to his barracks for lunch, and we stayed there. When he came back, he brought us some leftovers or anything we want to, and said, "Here, I'll be watching." And he said, "You go to sleep for a while." But he was an unusual human being.
In January 1944, Ernie suffered a serious injury that changed everything.
We were removing a retaining wall, and they had a very mild winter there, and suddenly the wall let go, and about 10 or 12 of us were injured. That's when I had a broken leg, a broken arm, and of course no hospital, no doctors. They had an infirmary, and we stayed there for a while.
Ernie wound up in a military hospital in a separate unit for the Jewish soldiers. Conditions were still decent for Jews. His family was allowed to visit him, and when he was well enough, he was transferred to Yugoslavia and then discharged from the army. But then, March arrived, and with it, the dissolution of the partnership between Germany and Hungary. The Jews, who had been relatively protected before by the Hungarians, were now at risk.
April 8th, it was the first day of Pesach, and then right the day after Pesach came an announcement, all the Jews, pack up your belongings, and we did. And your maximum is 50 kilos per family, that's 100 pounds or so. And we wound up in an abandoned brickyard factory. We arrived, they didn't have even where to put us, and we slept outside.
Because most men Ernie's age were either in the Hungarian army or labor camps, he was one of a small number of young, healthy men. The rest gathered at the station were either the old or very young. After about a month, the Jews were told to gather their belongings.
The Hungarian soldiers told us to unpack what you have. They wanted to make sure that nothing valuable was being taken out of the country. And I had a very nice leather coat. And the soldier tells me, he says, "Give me that coat." I says, "I can't. I'll need it where I am going." He says, "Where you are going, you will need it." And that was the first time that I realized there is something wrong. And we got on a kettle car, squeezed in, thrown together, young, old, it didn't make any difference.
The train was headed straight to Auschwitz.
And we get out of the train, And he says, raus, raus, schnell, schnell, out, out, fast, fast. And he got out and looked around, and I see these people in striped uniforms. The orders came, women on one side, men on another side, and then came the selection. All the able-bodied people were sent on one side, all the older people, and these people are children on the other side. I came into the barracks after the selections. There were people who came before we did, and I started to talk to them. I says, you know, I came here last night. I came an extended family, a large family. All of these people, says, were there older people? Yes. He says, and I saw it. You see the flames, you smell the stench, that's where they are. And I thought to myself, this is impossible, it's 20th century.
The Jews from Hungary were coming by the thousands every day. Most were gassed immediately. But those, like Ernie, who were selected to live, were put to work. A few days after his arrival in Auschwitz, he was sent to Warsaw, 300 miles away.
The Warsaw Ghetto uprising happened a year earlier. It was mostly destroyed, and our job was to go into the ghetto to salvage anything that's worthwhile, copper pipes and all these things, and to load it on freight cars after that and taking back to Germany.
Ernie's luck held, and he was soon picked for lighter duty, doing maintenance at the nearby SS headquarters. But every other week they still had selections, and the week were sent back to Auschwitz to be killed. By the end of July, the Jews could hear the Russians moving closer. The Germans evacuated, taking the prisoners on a death march west.
July, that's 28, 29, something like that. And we walked 80 kilometers, hot, impossibly hot, no water. So finally we arrived at the river. There was a bridge, the SS set up their sentries like that with the guns, with machine guns, and suddenly came the same voice, raus, raus, schnell, schnell. And those people who didn't make it fast, suddenly you saw a Red River, they just mowed them down.
Then they squeezed the surviving prisoners on trains.
Train started to move, and then suddenly it got very hot. By the evening and afternoon, very thirsty. The night came, a lot of us hallucinated. The second day already, it was a little bit easier because quite a few people died during the night, and we lined them up in the ends like that, so there was more room for those people who are still living. The third day we pulled up and the train stopped. We came out and we found out we were in Dachau.
For the next 6 months, Ernie worked in several different labor camps. In January 1945, he fell ill with typhus. He survived, and by April, things again changed.
By April, you could see the Allied Air Force was flying freely. And I think 9th of June or the 10th of June of 1945, we heard shooting. In the morning we woke up and there were nurses, medics, all kinds of things like that. The shooting was celebration, the V-Day.
Ernie found out after the war that 4 of the 6 brothers survived. Only one sister lived. She had come to Pittsburgh in the 1920s. Everybody else from his large extended family was gone.
I wanted to live. That was the most important thing. The minute you said I had enough, I don't want to live, and within a few days they all were dead. I was never selected in camp to be anything over somebody to in charge or anything like that. I have done nothing wrong, and I am free of any guilt. And that is my basic thing. It's very difficult to make peace with yourself. If you can make peace with yourself, you'll live a much happier life.
I owe my life to one individual. I was taken by this Polish Roman Catholic nun into a house, a basement. So I was kept there a few months after I was born until end of summer, early fall of 1944. So I was kept in this basement for all those years, locked up, deprived of any nourishment, much of food, stimulation of life. The only person who really gave me the human touch was this Polish Roman Catholic nun.
When Shulamit Bastaki was just an infant, her parents did the unthinkable. They gave her away. But they had good reason. Shulamit was born in Vilna, Poland on August 25, 1941. 2 months earlier, the Nazis had marched into Vilna with the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, murdering the Jewish residents at an alarming rate. In just a few months, they had killed more than 30,000 of the estimated 70,000 Jews in Vilna. The other 40,000 Jews were herded into a ghetto where they would stay until October.
At a certain point, they liquidated the ghetto, and so of course, many of the parents made any possible effort to save our lives.
Shulamit's parents found a Polish nun who was willing to risk her own life to save the baby.
She had to be awfully careful, because if someone would, from outside would see her, would denounce her, she would obviously be killed, and I certainly wouldn't be talking to you today.
When Shulamit was 12 years old, she learned the story of how she survived and about the courageous nun who answered a parent's plea.
My parents chose what to tell me and what not to tell me. And I do not know the procedures, what took place here. It's unbelievable that actually that I did survive that period, and a fairly, shall we say, normal person. But it's simply total deprivation. When I think of kids today, when I speak to students, I tell them, imagine when you were small, you were upset, your mother gave you hugs, love, attention, you had your teddy bears or something to hug. I had nothing to hold on to except that very basic human touch of this nun.
For nearly 3 years, Shulamit survived in that basement. But in July 1944, the Soviet army freed Vilna from the Germans.
So what happened next, as I was told that story, this nun didn't know what happened to my parents, so she bundled me up and put me on the banks of the river or lake, I don't remember which one. There was some Lithuanian guy who found me, and he took me then to a Lithuanian Catholic orphanage.
The story of the fate of the European Jewish children is an especially sad one. By the end of the war, it is estimated that as many as 1.5 million children were killed by the Nazis. The mortality rate for children was extremely high. Sickness and vulnerability made them particular targets. Children couldn't escape as quickly and easily as adults and were not thought to be useful for the Nazi slave labor machine. But thousands of children, including Shulamit, survived by being hidden either physically or with assumed identities, often aided by heroic and kind neighbors and strangers who risked their own lives and the lives of their families to save other human beings.
When the war was over, any parents who survived and had to give up their children were looking for me. So it was easier in those days for a man to look, so my father was looking all over the place, didn't find me where I was left, and totally by instinct, by guts, I don't know how, I don't know what guided him. By luck, he walked into this orphanage, and apparently he called me by my first name. I did not respond. But my father knew that I have a birthmark. He knew what that birthmark was and where it was. I won't tell that part. And that's the only reason and how my father recognized me, because if he would not have recognized me, I would have grown up with a very different identity, and who knows what would have become of me today. Nobody knows that part.
Shulamit's parents, Simon and Dora, had somehow survived the war while being held in a nearby slave labor camp.
Both of my parents were, in a way, if you can call it lucky, so-called lucky, in a local labor camp, slave labor camp. My father was an electrical engineer, so that's what saved me. My mother purely, I would believe, survived by luck. Anyone who is a survivor survived by luck.
But most of Shulamit's family wasn't so lucky. Shulamit lost aunts, uncles, and cousins. She learned what happened to much of her family from her aunt Yocheved, who survived and moved to Israel after the war ended.
She told me that the Germans, the Nazis, forced this one particular group of Jews to go to a synagogue and tragically put the building on fire. And I don't have to tell you what happens when you put much to a building. And in that building, all the people were simply murdered and burned alive. And in that group were 3 generations of that family. My grandmother Esther, may she rest in peace, her daughter Hadassah, that's my father's brother, and she had a boy whose name was Israel. He was about 3 or maybe 4 years old, I don't remember exactly. And that's how they perished.
Vilna was a city that had changed hands back and forth between the Poles and the Russians for centuries. When it was liberated from the Germans in 1944, it remained under Russian control. The Russians allowed Polish citizens to relocate within what was now communist Poland in 1945.
My parents made the choice to leave the area, move to central Poland. And I do remember being on a train that took us to Poland. And I do remember being in a rehab provided by Jewish organizations here, the Joint Distribution Organization, who provided some funds for rehabilitation, some of the survivors and most children because they suffered the most.
Shulamit went to rehab, then elementary and high school, like all children. In 1959, her family decided she should go live in Israel because Shulamit encountered anti-Semitism in her Polish school. She stayed in Israel for 5 years, then moved to the United States in 1963 to be reunited with her parents, who had also left Poland and settled in Pittsburgh. Shulamit went to college, then graduate school, and was a social worker for many years before she retired. She became active in the Holocaust Center. Over the past 12 years, she's spoken to thousands of students.
From 5th grade to university, I've spoken in Catholic churches, and I speak of this issue of hate and ignorance and intolerance, because I remember one of the students asked me, what is my revenge for the Holocaust? I said, young man, there is one response in 3 words: education, education, education. Because we have to fight intolerance and hate with the opposite. I always tell the students that instead of hating, put your love in your heart and see how wonderful things happen.
Shulamit missed a lot of things because of her past. Her first years of life were almost unbearable.
The touch, the affection, the love and tenderness that you miss from your parents. That's such a crucial part of child's development as a child, as a teenager, and as an adult. Not having that personal stimulation of life and tenderness and love. When I speak to kids, I always tell them, when you were little, you had your favorite teddy bears or favorite toys or maybe favorite security blanket. I had none of it. I bought myself my very first teddy bear when I came to this country at the age of 22 because I didn't have too many toys earlier in my life.
She's adopted the teddy bear, in fact, as a way of reaching out. She's exchanged the toys with Germans and others as a way of memorializing those who are not here, for whom there is no one speaking, and at the same time honoring those who made a difference. And Shulamit speaks to honor her own savior, that Polish Catholic nun. They met once more in 1955.
I was about 14 years old way back in Poland, and I remember that she wanted me to stand on a chair just to see, I guess, from her eye level, who is this young person whose life she saved. She's one of the reasons too that I do this. To me, it's kind of a mission. It's not about me, it's just what happened to human beings. My story is not as horrific as those who survived the camps.
Bergen-Belsen was emblematic of Nazi horrors until they found out later on about Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek. The big difference between Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen would be that in Auschwitz you suffered only 40 minutes. You were gone. In Bergen-Belsen, you suffered until you died.
Judah Samet remembers what it was like to be in Bergen-Belsen. At the age of 6, he and his family were sent to the infamous concentration camp located in northwestern Germany. The camp is perhaps best known because of one of its most famous prisoners, Anne Frank. But she was only one of the nearly 50,000 innocent people to die there. Judah's story begins with his birth in Hungary in 1938.
I had 2 brothers, Moshe and Yaakov, or Polly, and Tibi, and 1 sister, Henya, or Henche. I grew up in a very Orthodox home. We were well-to-do people. We had a knitting factory where we also had a retail section in there where we made clothes for the upper crust in our city. Debrecen was the 3rd largest city in Hungary.
When Judah was 2, in 1940, the Germans and Hungarians entered into an alliance. Hungary joined the Axis and participated in the invasions of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Life for the 825,000 Hungarian Jews was tenuous. There was discriminatory legislation against the Jews and widespread anti-Semitism, but they were relatively secure. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Miklos Kale, even refused to deport the Hungarian Jews, despite significant pressure from the domestic radical right. But everything changed when the German and Hungary Pact ended in March 1944.
In that 1st or 2nd week of April, they took us out of our homes. The Gendarmerie, led by the Gestapo, came to our street and ordered us to vacate, gave us 15 minutes, ordered us to take with us only the very basic things, 1 underwear change, our important papers, jewelry, money, and so forth. They marched us to the railway. It took most of the day, a little cold and drizzly. It was early spring, late winter. We parked at the railroad waiting for transportation. There were a few thousands of us there. My mother volunteered to be the cook. They supplied us with 2 or 3 or 4 bed tops, and she was cooking soup. That's the only thing that they gave us, soup and some bread.
Judah and his family, along with thousands of other Jews, waited. The Nazis arranged 2 transports. Those on the first were crammed into trains that went directly to Auschwitz. But the Samets remained behind at the station.
A few weeks later, the second transport arrived, and we were all on the platform waiting to be loaded onto the cattle cars. 30, 40, 50 to each car. My mother noticed that they were carrying 2 buckets into each car. One bucket was filled with water, and the other bucket was for toilet purposes.
Judah's mother, Rachel, risked her life to beg the Nazi commandant for larger drums of water. It wasn't the first or the last time that Rachel would use her wits to plead for her family.
She was a tower of strength. She never wavered. She was never scared. Her mind was dedicated 24 hours a day to saving her family. And she was not afraid of anybody, whether it was the German commandant or anything like that.
Because the family had waited for the second transport, luck was with them. Partisans had bombed the railways in Czechoslovakia, so the captive Jews were farmed out as slave laborers instead of going directly to Auschwitz and almost certain death.
We ended up in a lumber yard. The lumber yard was owned by a major Nazi in Austria. He had some French prisoners of war, some Italian prisoners of war, but we were treated differently than they were. We were limited to food, and there again, my mother did something that was a risk to her life.
Judah's mother would sneak out of the labor camp after work and visit the village. She offered to knit clothing, doilies, anything in exchange for cheese, milk, and eggs from the local villagers. That food helped keep her family alive. But one day, someone turned her in, and she was arrested.
That my mother was not shot on the spot was a miracle. She was put in jail. She shared the room with a German girl. Now, what was the crime of the German girl is that she would not follow Hitler's orders to pleasure German soldiers coming home for furlough from the Russian front. She ended up hung.
The Samet family never expected to see Rachel again.
And my mother somehow managed to come back to the lumberyard. We kind of gave up on her. We thought she was surely dead. So it just shows again my mother's initiative and mental strength. She was a very, very unusual woman. Then after a while there was transportation became available, and they took us to Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen was originally built as a prisoner of war camp, but in 1943 the SS began using it as a concentration camp. The Samets arrived there in June 1944 and stayed until just 2 weeks before the camp's liberation by the British on April 15, 1945. Judah has faded, yet often vivid memories of his time there.
I cannot remember exactly what we did every single day. I know that the food that we received was a loaf of bread for the family, the size of a small cantaloupe, and it was very hard, it was black, it was supposed to last a week. So we were hungry all the time.
Hunger was always there. So was death.
Every morning when we got up for the roll call, there was a stack of 3 stories high of corpses. By the end of the day, they were gone. Next morning, the same. Every day, 1,000 to 1,500.
One incident still disturbs Judah.
There was roll call, and for some reason, I stayed in bed. I didn't get up. And there was another old man about 7 bunks down from me. And this fellow in a blue uniform must have been one of the Croatian guards. The Germans employed Croatians and Ukrainians who were very, very anti-Semitic. They were worse than the Nazis. And I saw, he said to the old man, "Get up." He didn't get up, so he hit him with his. with a metal stick 3-4 times, and he killed him, and he didn't see me. Now, did it happen, or was it a nightmare?
Starvation and sickness surrounded the prisoners. Judah became quite ill because of the lice infestation. One of his bites became infected.
As a kid, I didn't pay attention to it until I was in terrible pain, and I said my head hurts, and my mother touched me, and she said I was burning with fever. So lucky for us, there was a doctor in our barrack.
With no painkillers, the doctor operated on Judah's head. He still carries the scar, a constant reminder of his time in Bergen-Belsen.
So I have like a valley right here on my back. And thank God it doesn't bother me. Sometimes a little bit when the weather changes. So that was definitely a miracle in my case.
In early spring, the Germans asked for volunteers from Bergen-Belsen to go work in a labor camp. Rachel Sammet jumped at the chance for her family to escape the horrible conditions. They traveled for days, squeezed yet again into a cattle car, with the car stopping every few days to empty the dead. One day, it stopped altogether.
And we were in the woods, deep forest on both sides. And there was nobody there, and the doors were open. The Germans were gone. I thought, this is it, they're going to finish us here. And we heard a rumbling of something, of a military vehicle, which turned out to be a tank. And it came out of the woods, and we thought, this is it. It was kind of funny that the turret was not aimed at us, it was aimed to the side. And when the turret opened, it was an American. So we were saved. Our liberation probably came a few days after Bergen-Belsen's liberation.
It took Judah another 60 years before he began to publicly tell people about his experiences as a child in the infamous Bergen-Belsen camp.
Of course, I realized that I'm 73, and I'm one of the youngest to survive. But I still have memories of that. And I have perspective, I have context. And knowing what's going on around the world, in 10, 15 years, there's not going to be alive to tell the story. So how will they know? I'm a living witness.
The Germans were chasing us from one end, and the Russians wouldn't let us in at the other end.
Harry Schneider is remembering the summer of 1941 when his family left their home in Lomży, Poland, and fled to the Soviet Union to escape the Nazis. Harry was just 4 years old at the time. Between 1939 and 1941, nearly 300,000 Polish Jews, almost 10% of the Polish Jewish population, crossed into the Soviet zone to escape the German onslaught.
Part of the family didn't want to move. It's my grandmother, as an example. She was just too old to travel. And one of the other brothers also had married and had children, so they wanted to stay. My father came back from the army, and he says, we better get out of here, because he heard some of the atrocities that already happened in other towns. And so we started to go east.
The Soviet Union and Germany signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939. In a secret deal, the two countries carved up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of interest. Harry's hometown was located in eastern Poland, near the Soviet border, and was in Soviet hands from September 1939 until June 1941, when the Germans came in. That's when his family fled.
We spent some times, like in the forest and the swamps in that area. And we finally reached Brest or Brest-Litovsk in Russia. One of my mother's brothers happened to be married to someone that lived there. So we finally wound up in Russia. But what happened is once the agreement between the Germans and the Russians broke up, the Germans started to invade, going further east.
So the Schneider family, too, moved further and further east. Once in Russia, Harry's dad was drafted into the Russian army.
The Russian government, they just put myself, my mother, this cousin, and by that time I already had a sister who was born actually in Russia in 1941. They put us on the train and they sent us to Ural, which is near Siberia. When the Germans were bombing the train and the rails, I can remember jumping off and on the trains, once we heard the airplanes coming along. So I do remember going down, hiding, and getting back on the train.
The long journey ended near Siberia, one of the coldest inhabited places in the world.
So we lived there with they just placed us with a woman whose husband was on the Western Front, fighting the Germans. And it was bitter cold there, but somehow we were able to survive there.
Siberia is an extensive land area of Russia, covering almost all of northern Asia. It is where the Soviets established some of their biggest prison camps and sentenced millions of people to forced labor from 1930 to 1960. And it is where the Soviet Union deported tens of thousands of Jews who escaped the Nazis into the Soviet zone. Jews were sent there and to other remote areas in the interior of the Soviet Union. And though conditions were harsh, most managed to survive the Holocaust. They were the largest group of European Jews to survive the Nazis.
When we got to Russia, it was bitter cold, and I actually started going to school, kindergarten, although it was probably maybe only 4 hours in the morning, and my mother was able to get a job actually at the railroad station, so I also had to take care of my little sister. And we had a difficult time also getting food. Had to go out sometimes in the farms and more or less like steal food and trying to pick out some potatoes or something that they had buried. They wanted to make sure that the frost didn't get to the potatoes. Well, I got to them first. I had blue eyes and I had blonde hair, so I wasn't able to sneak around in the people's farms and bring back some food. And there's many times these farmers took out shotguns that were shooting at me, and I was on the run. Also, the food was rationed, and I do remember many times standing in long lines with a bucket trying to get a little bit of milk for my sister because she was so young, she had to have some milk.
Life was difficult, but Harry, his mother, sister, and cousin were safe until 1945, when the war ended. At the time, anyone who was born or came from Poland was allowed to go back. The Schneiders decided to return to see if anyone from the family survived the war.
We didn't hear anything from my father. We didn't know if he was alive or not. My mother decided that we were going to go back to Poland to see if anyone was alive or, what was happening. And so my mother, myself, and my sister went back to Poland, and we were actually placed. Everybody came into like a DP camp, a displaced persons camp. Later we found out that my father also came back with the Russian army back into Poland, and he went back to the area that we lived, hoping maybe he could find someone. And he found out that the house was destroyed.
Like thousands of lucky people, Harry's father finally found the remnants of his family in the DP camp. But Poland was still dangerous for the Jews. In July 1946, 41 Jews were murdered and 50 wounded when Polish mobs of the city of Kielce rioted against them. Anti-Semitism still existed, and many feared that hundreds of Jews would come to reclaim their property confiscated by non-Jews during the German occupation. Anti-Jewish riots broke out in several Polish cities.
We weren't going to stay in Poland. We were trying to find a better place to go. We all went to Austria, and we wound up there in the American zone in a DP camp.
The Schneiders stayed in Austria several years before finally settling in the United States.
The immediate family survived, just my father, mother, my sister, one of the uncles, which is Mendel, and the cousin who lives in Israel. That's it. There's a book on the Lom Jews. From what we understand, in 1942, they took them all outside of town into the forest, and they were all massacred. So I would imagine that most of my mother's family, my grandmother and her brother remained there, and their children, I guess they were all massacred there.
Though Harry felt fortunate to survive, as he got older, he began to realize what his family lost.
I started to understand as to what happened to the family, and nobody really talked too much about it. But I could gather, that all of a sudden I didn't have any grandparents. I lost uncles, nieces, nephews. I guess as a kid, I was bitter. I was bitter even coming to the States. It's like I probably had like a chip on my shoulder for a long time.
Though for many years, Harry didn't consider himself a Holocaust survivor, he now travels to schools to tell young people his story.
Trying to tell them that there was a Holocaust, and to remember it can happen again. And I try to tell them that one of the worst things is hatred, prejudice. You have to stay away from that. And I tell them each one of you can do a lot of good by being a good person.
Jewish people have lived in Greece longer than anywhere else on the European continent. Their presence there can be traced back more than 2,400 years. But in just 3 years, the years the Nazis occupied Greece from the spring of 1941 to October 1944, the Nazis nearly succeeded in wiping out every single Greek Jew. Ray Nahr and his immediate family were among the lucky few who survived. He was born in 1927 in the city of Salonika in the northern part of Greece.
Salonika at that time was the second largest city in Greece. There was a very large and very well-to-do Jewish community, not at all unlike the Jewish community here in Pittsburgh. It was a very sophisticated community. We spoke French at home. We went to French school, which was kind of like Galley School here, or Shadyside Academy. And French has always been like my native tongue.
Ray remembers that the Jewish community in Salonika numbered close to 70,000 people. Only about 1,500 survived. But the Jews faced anti-Semitism even before Hitler came to power.
Salonika was occupied by the Turks until 1921, and the Jewish population flourished under Turkish governance. And then when the Greeks fought for their independence, the Jewish population did not rally to the cause with a lot of enthusiasm. And the Greeks resented that. Another reason was that the Greeks came from Asia Minor, They were very poor, you know, they were refugees, and the Jews who were established in Salonika were very well off.
Despite that, the Jews and the Greeks coexisted until spring 1941, when the Germans defeated the Greek army. They occupied Greece, dividing the country into 3 zones. The Bulgarians, part of the Axis with Germany, annexed the northeasternmost part of the country. Germany occupied the middle part of Greece, including Salonika and the areas around and including Athens, and Italy, also part of the Axis, took the rest of the mainland and the Greek islands. Where the Jews lived ultimately determined their fate.
When Italy attacked Greece through Albania, life continued pretty much the way it was. When Italy was being defeated by Greece, then the German army came to the rescue and invaded Salonika. The beginning, the first year, it was fine, you know, they never bothered anyone, and then the SS came. My whole family, except my father, mother, my brother, and I, because we were Spanish citizens, they had to wear a star. They had to move to a neighborhood in the city, which became known as a ghetto. They lost their businesses, they could not buy property, they could not own newspaper. My father was a newspaperman, and the newspaper was confiscated, he was arrested, he was beaten up. Then, of course, there was the famine. It was a terrible, terrible famine in Salonika. I remember the winter in 1941. Bread was worth its weight in gold. You know, children would die of malnutrition, and couldn't even bury them. You know, they would pick them up in the morning, and it was a very bad scene. And then the deportation started, little by little, block by block. You know, people would just disappear and go.
The Greek people, and especially leaders in the Greek Orthodox Church, tried to protect the Jewish population, hiding Jews and issuing false baptismal certificates. And the Nar family was especially fortunate. They had Spanish citizenship. It protected them because they were classified as exchange Jews, to be eventually exchanged for German prisoners of war. But soon, they lost everything they had.
We had a living room, which was a genuine Louis XV, with genuine gold layers, and we had a big sofa, which now would have been worth thousands of dollars. Oh, we sold them to a villager for 200 pounds of flour, and on and on and on.
On March 15, 1943, the Germans began deporting the Salonika Jews to Auschwitz. 2,000 Jews every 3 days. By summer, over 46,000 were gone. The Nar family avoided the deportations, but then they learned the SS would be coming for them. They turned to the Italian Consul General, Giuseppe Castruccio. On June 18th, Castruccio organized a rescue train to take some of the remaining Salonika Jews to Athens, which was then under Italian occupation. The Italians were protective of the Jewish community and tried to save as many as they could. Castruccio issued Italian passports for several hundred Jews, including the Nar family.
It was the general policy of the Italian government to protect their Jews as much as they could. My father spoke excellent Italian. And there were Italian MPs at one end of the train, Italian MPs at the other end of the station, ready to switch us from car to car if the Gestapo were coming. Then they took us to Athens, and we were on our own for another year until it started all over in Athens.
The Nar family began a new life in Athens. Ray enjoyed life there, making friends, even having a Greek girlfriend. But in April 1944, the Germans arrested the Nars.
They put us in cattle cars and they took us directly to Bergen-Belsen. We had absolutely no idea what would happen, and from the railroad station we carried our belongings to the camp. We're the camp, and camps are just like you saw them on television. They were 3-decker beds, and the food was not very good or plentiful. The worst part was that we did not do anything. We almost wished, that they would take us out to work. And it was same thing every day. We would get up very early in the morning for roll call. Roll call would last any time from 1 hour to 2 hours, and the rest of the day we just sitting, waiting, not knowing what would happen. Towards the end it was pretty bad because Belsen was hit with an epidemic of typhus, and there were bodies thrown all over the camp. You could tell the end was near.
Despite that, Ray, who is a psychologist, explains that the mental condition of most prisoners was surprising.
My impression is that there's seldom been a population as mentally healthy as prisoners in camp. We didn't have time to have neurotic symptoms or psychotic symptoms, whatever. All our energies were devoted to one thing, how to survive from one day to the other, how to find an extra piece of bread or something. The fears that we had in the camps were very legitimate fears. We could be killed from one day to the next. Then the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen. But 1 week before the British Army came, there were about 2,000 of us whom they were not supposed to keep as prisoners. There were Spanish Jews, American Jews, British, Swiss, and Turks. Citizens of countries which either were at war with Germany or were neutral. So they did not want the British to find us. They put us in a train on the way to Theresienstadt, and from what I read, they were supposed to annihilate us or eliminate us somehow so we would not be found.
The Nars and other prisoners, however, escaped that fate. The train traveled west about 100 miles, but stopped when it encountered the U.S. Army. The 3rd Armored Division of the United States Army liberated all the prisoners on board.
Our group, most of us survived. Many died afterwards. We survived by the skin of our teeth. I was pretty strong and excellent health, and yet when we were liberated, I had TB. We were part of a very large family. My grandmother, my graduating class, my girlfriend, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. We were a very close family. They were all killed. And that's just chance, a fluke, because we never gave up our Spanish citizenship. We always kept it.
Where you were determined whether you lived or died. Those under German occupation were sent to the concentration and death camps, most to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Jews under the Italians were protected, and many Greek citizens tried to save as many Jews as they could.
In Athens, out of 10,000 Jews, more than 9,000 were saved. So it was a big, big difference. We were too frigging civilized. A good Jewish boy does not handle a gun, does not resist authority, you do what you're told. Obeying authority was part of being good. When I came to this country, the first thing I did 6 months later was to join the army. I was pathologically afraid that somehow, somewhere this could happen again, and I was not, ever. So I learned to shoot guns. I was pretty good. There are two messages. One is that you don't let yourself be pushed around. That's the most important. The second message is that you don't let other people be pushed around.
You can look at pictures of concentration camps and you can say, this is terrible, this is awful, but you can't smell them. It was a stench, it was the smell of death.
In the spring of 1945, Herbert Mandel was a soldier in the United States Army, Charlie Battery. His division had just finished fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle of World War II. Allied forces pushed the Germans back into their own territory, and the U.S. Army was on the offensive, trying to strike at the heart of German munitions operations.
The Ruhr was the big industrial heart of Germany. When it had been reduced to the point where armor couldn't move that far, my battery, Charlie Battery, was pulled out and went around the Ruhr into the Harz Mountains.
On April 12, 1945, C Battery wasn't being fired upon, so Herb, who was on reconnaissance, was just waiting for some action with some of his fellow soldiers in an open field.
I saw, and the others saw, 3 men in striped suits walk into our position and picking up cigarette butts. One of them had his hand bandaged, and he saw our medic with the Red Cross on his helmet, and he went over to him.
The man spoke no English, but Charlie Battery's sergeant was fluent in Polish.
So he called him over, and Sergeant Madge listened to this guy, and he said, "My God, we've overrun a concentration camp." "What? Where is it?" "Right back there, about 300 yards. We drove past this camp and set up, and the guards took off, and there the inmates were." I'll tell you exactly what had happened. April 12th, 1945.
Herb had read about concentration camps, but wasn't prepared for what awaited him.
I had no idea what it was in the flesh, you know. The division commander said, we got to do something about this because this is appalling. And he appointed one of the medical officers to go in and get medical treatment for the inmates, evacuate them and get medical treatment for them. So ambulances started arriving at the camp. The drivers were wearing gas masks. Why? Because of the smell.
6 days later, when the German army was almost in total collapse, Herb and his 2 friends decided to visit the camp.
There were still hundreds of people there. An inmate came up to me and asked if I spoke French. Well, I did speak French. I spoke high school French. He became my guide through the camp, our guide. And we gathered about a dozen people around us as we went through the camp, and he told me all about the camp. The camp had been liberated 6 days. They had been evacuating the worst cases. Even though the worst cases were, in theory, gone, they were still dying. And I saw a pit in which there were 13 bodies of people who died so far that day. And each day they would bury in the pit those that had died. And then the next day's dead would be placed on top, and then they'd be covered. He also told me that 5,000 had died that winter. They were digging an underground aircraft factory out of the sandstone there in the Hartz Mountains. As they would die, they'd bring in replacements.
For the next 2 hours, Herb and his unit toured the camp they learned was called Langenstein.
What I saw were one-story buildings made of wood. Inside the buildings were bunk beds stacked 4 high, and each one of those held 2 people. Those 2 people shared one blanket over the most severe winter that I've ever experienced. It was one of the worst winters in Europe's history. It was just a miserable winter. Those that were in the bunks were absolutely skeletal. They were lying there and they were just waiting for something to happen, either to be evacuated or to die. The people who could walked very slowly. They could just hardly manage to walk. They were all suffering from malnutrition. And furthermore, they had all kinds of illnesses.
Herb heard stories from the prisoners of the cruelty of the guards.
I got an inkling right from the beginning when this injured inmate went to the medic. Well, what happened to him? Well, one of the guards got a hold of this fellow and cut his finger off with a bayonet as a parting shot. That's why his hand was bandaged in a piece of filthy cloth.
Only 20 years old at the time, the experience left a huge mark on Herb Mandel's life.
That experience and the Holocaust in general has had the greatest negative impact on my life, more than anything else ever. It is just a horror to contemplate. It goes beyond imagination. And there I saw it with my own eyes.
But when Herb first returned home to the United States, he never discussed what he had seen firsthand. Not until just a few years ago, Herb found out his armored field artillery unit was having a reunion. He decided to attend, and there he met a doctor who had served with the battalion.
There was this little guy, Dr. Metrick. I went up to him and I said, "Dr. Metrick?" He said, "Yes." I said, "My name is Herb Mandel. I'm from the 399th. He said, "The 399th? You're the guys that liberated Langenstein." I said, "Yes, I'm from Charlie Battery. We're the ones that did it." He said, "Well, I'm the guy that had to evacuate all the inmates of Langenstein and find places where they could be treated. That was my job at that time." Now, here's a little history of Langenstein. As the war was ending and the Germans saw that we were going to not only win, but catch them, Langenstein was ordered evacuated by the Germans. Everybody who could walk was to be marched out, and the others were to be left to die. So the people that we saw at the camp were left to die. 3,000 went out on that march. I don't know how many survived. You know, we can't imagine what these people went through day after day after day, minute by minute, torture. We just can't imagine it, but they did. Breaks your heart.
Now Herb Mandel travels to local schools to tell students what he saw, to teach them the lessons of the Holocaust.
Never let this happen again. And if there's the slightest inkling of it, fight it tooth and nail. Any attempt to limit the liberties of anyone should be stopped in its tracks. Don't let it happen again.
Many Jewish people never thought that France would let it happen. And they were wrong. They didn't prepare for it.
Solange Stratler-Leibowitz is talking about the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews who were French citizens at the time of the war, Jews who had moved to France for a better life, or those who had taken refuge there when Hitler came to power.
My parents read the Jewish newspaper, The Forward. They were very well informed of what happened in Poland. But even before that, when they knew, they didn't believe it would ever happen and occur in France.
The story of the Jewish people in France during Hitler's reign is a complicated one. The reason is that though the Germans overran France in 1940, they allowed a French government to operate. The Vichy government, as it was called, deported at least 75,000 individuals, a figure that doesn't take into account the several thousands who died on French soil from starvation and disease in France's camps. Of those deported from France, only 3% survived. 6,000 children under the age of 12 did not return. But many French people, members of the clergy, and French resistors fought hard to save Jewish lives.
There were about 330,000 Jews living in France, maybe about 150,000 living in Paris. My parents were immigrants from Siget, Transylvania, in the late 1920s, and they came with 4 children to Paris. And 2 children were born, my sister Bert, who is a year older than I am, and myself.
Solange's family, the Stratlers, had come to France because it seemed like a safe, progressive country.
Transylvania was part first of Hungary and then Romania, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism. The economy was very bad. Most of the men were leaving for the United States, Canada, or South America. Instead of going to the States, it was very difficult to do. He decided to go to France because France had lost a lot of the soldiers, close to 1 million or more. And they welcomed, you know, the workers from East European and Italy and so forth.
But soon, the French established quotas.
They say the foreigners are taking our jobs. So they had a law. A company could not hire a foreigner except for every 10 Frenchmen. So my father lost his job.
The Stratlers managed to eke out a living. Solange was born in Paris in 1930, and when she was 8, she was sent to a medical facility because she was a sickly child. She had been there for almost a year when the Germans declared war on Poland.
I was not able to go home. And of course I didn't know about the war. I was just 9 years old. But I remember that the women cried because they knew their husband, their children, and so forth were going to war. So eventually, I think in December or January, I was sent back to Paris with the group of children, and my father was waiting for me.
On May 10, 1940, the Germans attacked France, and 6 weeks later, the French surrendered, signing an armistice agreement. By an overwhelming majority, France's democratically elected members of government, its parliament, ended the country's many years of democracy by voting itself out of existence and creating a dictatorship with France's World War I hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain, as its leader. Germany annexed Alsace and Lorraine in northeast France and occupied most of northern France, while in July in the southern unoccupied part of the country, Pétain installed a puppet government in the town of Vichy. In all of the Nazi-conquered nations of Europe, France alone had a collaborationist government that was neither selected nor imposed by the Germans. Pétain was put in office by democratically elected representatives of the French people, and the majority of the country considered him to be the legitimate head of state. Without direction from Nazi Germany, the Vichy government promulgated anti-Semitic laws, which were as punishing and discriminatory as those of the Third Reich. They excluded Jews from public life and public jobs, barred them from many professions, and forced them to wear the yellow star. And they appropriated Jewish property for France, leaving most Jews destitute.
So I went to school in Paris for a short while, and the school teacher that I had was Jewish, and they fired her. And they fired doctors, lawyers, engineers, all the professionals from their job.
Then, the arrest began.
In 1941, Philippe Pétain arrested doctors, famous judges, and from then on, it was a constant arrest.
Deportations of Jews began soon after that. On January 20th, 1942, the first transport of Jews from France left for Auschwitz. Soon the French were rounding up Jews, not the native French Jews, but Jews like the Dratlers who had come to France in the 1920s and 30s. The Vichy government deported these so-called foreigners in a bizarre effort to save their native Jews. Roundups became commonplace. One of the worst happened in Paris on July 16th and 17th, 1942.
Pétain and his cohorts, they arrested about 13,000 Jews. Old people, young people, children, babies. It was infamous. They took them by bus to Le Veldiv. Le Veldiv was a velodrome d'hiver, which was like stadium, sports stadium. And they kept them there close to a week. The people had grabbed whatever they had, and there were maybe one doctor, one nurse, no hygienic facilities. And once you were there, you couldn't get off.
The Dratler family knew the police would soon be coming for them. Solange's brother and father fled to Limoges, which was part of the Free France, to escape arrest. Her brother joined the resistance movement, and the rest of the family ended up in Limoges. Solange was sent to Normandy to live with an older couple paid to take care of her.
I must say they were very good to me. They sent me to church every Sunday and to school. So I stayed with them. I went by my regular name, and I went to school. I knew also of another girl who was Jewish, but the climate of fear was such that even if you suspected that the other girls were Jewish, we were not going to ask each other if you're Jewish because you never knew.
Solange was nearly captured once at the school by a German soldier who came looking for Jews.
So there was a German soldier who came to the door. He looked, and I had red hair and blue eyes. So, you know, I was not what they call the stereotype. So he left, and then later on I went back to my class.
Despite a few close calls, Solange's life was fairly stable. She does, however, remember June 1944 quite vividly. That was during D-Day, when the Allies invaded France to fight the Germans on the European front. Solange was living in Normandy, site of the invasion. She and other young people were sent further away from the front to stay safe.
I remember as we were a suitcase and everything, running through the field, and I could see the bombs falling, and that always stays in my memory. The planes, the Allied planes, they had like two tails or something, and as we ran, we could see the bomb falling ahead. We thought it's falling on us, but I don't know where they were falling, and we went down on, under the tree, and then we didn't see anything. We ran further.
Solange lived with the couple from 1942 until December 1944. Her parents didn't know if she was alive, but once they got word, her father came to pick her up in December, and the family was reunited. She's not sure how they all survived.
I mean, it's a miracle. Maybe because we were all separated in different places, maybe we had a better chance, because actually, while we were all separated, everybody was in danger.
Many times, Solange and her family were saved by good neighbors who warned them when the Germans were coming to arrest them. Others helped them escape, and yet others got the family false papers so they could flee Paris. Even Solange's brother was hidden by nuns who vouched for him when the Nazis came to find Jews to send to the concentration camps. But France was a contradiction.
The upper clergy, they were all for Pétain. And the newspaper with the caricature of the Jews, all these people who were, and the collaborators like Vichy, Marshal Pétain, and the others. But at the same time, you did have a lot of good French to help.